Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second Sharing Leading Practice event of the new year. For those of you who have not attended a Sharing Leading Practice event before, they were formerly known as our Leadership Development Days, where schools with an accredited area of excellence share their best practice. So a big positive to them now being virtual events is that we're able to share them across the length and breadth of the country. And we have now run around 30 SLPs over the last 18 months. We're really excited to have Lou Bridges and Avi Rajput with us today. Louise is the maths lead and Avi is second in faculty to Lou. They are both from Rushey Mead Academy, which is part of the East Midlands South Hub. Now, before I hand over to Lou and Abby, who'll be talking about their maths curriculum journey, I just wanted to go over a couple of our housekeeping rules, if that's okay. So thank you to those of you who have already introduced yourself in the chat function. If you haven't done so already, please do so by saying what school you're from and if there's anything you'd particularly like to get out of the session today. There'll be time throughout the presentation for questions, and I believe Lou and Avi have factored in time for a Q&A towards the end of the session too. Please do put any thoughts or comments in the chat for the wider group as we go along. If you could also please remain muted during the presentation as it prevents any background noise. If you do want to unmute yourself, just hover over the little microphone icon in the bottom left-hand corner. I also suggest putting your screens on speaker view, which is found in the top right-hand corner if you haven't done so already. If you haven't done so already, please do change your Zoom name to your first name and last name, as it makes it much easier for us to record who has attended. Towards the end of the session, I will be posting a link to our feedback form, which would be great if you could please complete it. Feedback is really valuable to us and helps guide our future events. Finally, this session is being recorded, so if you do not want to feature, please let me know. I will now stop sharing my screen and hand over to Lou and Abby. Thank you both so much for leading today's session.
Thank you, Rebecca. I will just share my screen. Okay, guys, welcome. I'm just going to explain. Unfortunately, I'm having to isolate at the minute, so I'm not feeling very well. So apologies for my video not being on. And again, also apologies if at any point I have end up coughing and disturbing things. I will try and keep that to an absolute minimum. She says, coughing. Okay, so obviously talking about where our journey began, really. So back in 2014, there was obviously lots of changes afoot in education. There was the Ofsted report from Jane Jones of the maths should not be taught as a disparate set of skills. There was obviously the NCTEM hubs were set up. We had new programmes of study for Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. Okay, so this was kind of where we were within our journey. Now, we had a long-standing faculty at the time. There wasn't a lot of movement. Okay, I would say, our results were good. They were above national average. And we had a lot of great teachers creating a lot of great lessons. The student experience, however, was not necessarily consistent. Assessments weren't necessarily standardised. And homework wasn't necessarily standardised. Okay, and obviously all of this kind of led to increased individual teacher workload. Okay, and we were also aware that many of our students were undertaking tuition. So this was kind of the start of our journey. Okay, we were aware of the changes that were afoot. Okay, the increased demand within the new spec, and we obviously had to present this kind of case for change for obviously the whole faculty. Okay, obviously a lot of people have been doing things excuse me, in a very similar way for quite a while. So we had to present this case for change and obviously try and get people on board, and understandably, because things were from the outset, from the kind of the headline figures were still going good. It was quite difficult initially to get people on board. But they kind of saw that the need for the change within obviously the new demands of the curriculum. Okay, we also knew that we obviously needed to increase, or appreciated we had to increase our curriculum time at Key Stage 4. So we went from 3 lessons per week to 4 lessons per week. And obviously then we had to kind of identify the expertise across the faculty and look at the process of rewriting our curriculum. So Rushey, we were redefining the assessment systems after levels were removed, and the whole school system was, I'm sure, something that's familiar to a lot of you, is the concept of students on different pathways. Okay, we didn't think that that worked exactly in maths, as we didn't want there to be knowledge that wasn't taught to all. So we were mindful of the tiers of entry, but still thought we needed a kind of nuanced approach. So we identified 12 key strands across mathematics, and we utilised the school framework to break down the progression of learning for each strand and track progression within, back from year 11 down to year 7. Okay, and we were emphasis always going on beyond the basic knowledge. We had, as you could see across each of those, the know, the use, apply, the problem solve. So we wanted kind of the emphasis for, you know, both the students and the teachers to know that we wanted the knowledge to have the depth within that, rather than just kind of going up through the kind of those levels. So excuse me, this allowed us the progression through each, what we called at that point, the assessment point. So each strand or unit, as we've later called it, could be viewed in this format, so you could see through each of those strands. Okay, and we had an emphasis that within each AP, the development of that declarative knowledge, you know, what they needed to know, onto that procedural knowledge, the use and apply, and then obviously onto that conditional knowledge about the problem solve and reasoning. So we had 12 units, but obviously we needed to consider the order of those units. We all felt strongly that we needed a number and calculations to come first, because they were the fundamentals and what everything else was based on, and it allowed us the opportunity to revisit these through other units. Obviously, algebraic manipulation is another important element, but it's a means for students to further develop those number and calculation skills, and we were keen for students to see the link. Okay, we wanted them to see that it was algebra was that generalization of number, okay, rather than see it as some sort of mysterious element of their maths journey. And we were keen that we were making links explicit, okay, ensuring students can appreciate that the individual elements of their learning are pieces of a larger picture, that are all interconnect. Okay, and it's fair to say that this was the first time the order of the units was the same for every year group. Okay, the previous scheme of work, different year groups were obviously working on different areas of the curriculum. Okay, and one of the things that kind of came up as a something for us all to consider, and that some people thought that it would possibly become tiresome for the teacher, because within every group they were potentially covering the same element of learning. However, what we found in reality was that the teaching the same unit across the different groups helped the teacher. Okay, reflection on that teaching within one group would not only impact that group, but it was also useful and was impacting, you know, the teaching of those other groups, as we were heightening our awareness within those individual units. Okay, and obviously, as you can see above, there's kind of when we looked at something in year 7, you know, we start off with those multiplying fractions and multiplying decimals. Those skills were all kind of transferable, and we kind of linked in that learning and kept revisiting it across those other areas. Excuse me. So those were our 12 units, and obviously the order has changed over time, but at the moment that is the order that we visit those units in across the year. Okay, and the scheme of work 3 to 5 are fundamentally the foundation content. Okay, so we had the initial idea, we had the principle of what we were kind of wanting to set out in terms of the units and what we were covering. We obviously need to put now some flesh on the bones. So we started out every unit and made a decision that we would start with something that we decided to call a quick check, which is obviously a series of diagnostic questions to help the teacher gauge where the groups or the individual's level of expertise lies, with the prerequisite skills for the learning points within that unit. Okay, and obviously the learning points, it could be split up between just one learning point, or each unit could be potentially, you know, 3 or maybe even 4 learning points. The questions have been carefully considered, as probably all of you are aware in terms of diagnostic questions, so that each incorrect answer highlights a possible misconception. And as we mentioned lately, we regularly spend time as a faculty exploring diagnostic questions to help develop our understanding of the misconceptions and how to address these in the lessons, both in the initial exposition of a particular skill and later through our assessment for learning. So we also had a big question, okay, and this is obviously a whole school approach. We always have a big question, so each learning point had a big question, and it's split up into the bronze, silver and gold, where the bronze is that procedural, the silver is, the bronze is the declarative, the silver is the procedural, and then that gold is looking at that conditional knowledge building from those. Okay. And again, obviously, we can see we had this slide that was kind of emphasis to the teacher and the students about the fact that this was their journey through their learning, that they needed all of those pieces to get to the problem solve and reasoning. Okay. So every unit was broken down into the same format. Students were familiar with the format and the expectations, you know, of both us of them, but them of us, so they knew what to expect within those units. Okay. Again, emphasis to the students on that pathway, again, that idea of that declarative knowledge, the procedural knowledge, and that conditional knowledge. So we obviously have the basic format that we shared with the teachers. We also then created some selected resources, because, you know, once we'd got that kind of basic foundation, the expectation was for the teachers to go away and to, you know, create their lessons based on the big question. Okay, so they had a lot of work potentially still to do, but we'd obviously tried to narrow down that with obviously highlighting some potential of some, you know, selected resources that would help them to kind of narrow down the time that people were spending having to go through that process. Okay. Assessments were also produced centrally. So we had these end of unit reviews focusing on skills within that unit of learning for both student and teacher, to allow them to judge the areas of strength and weakness once that unit of learning had been completed. And we referenced Corbett maths videos, obviously the subsequent practice questions that they could utilise as part of the further independent practice. Okay, so we've kind of tried to build a PACE system whereby the students are taking an equal responsibility for their learning, and we're providing them with kind of signposts to things that will help them with kind of moving their learning forward. Okay, and obviously identifying where maybe their strengths and weaknesses are. Termly assessments, again, were also completed centrally, and we then obviously always follow those up, and we do still follow them up with these rag sheets that we call them, for, again, for the students and the teachers to be able to see at a glance the aspects of, you know, a recent assessment that will still need further review. Okay, so we ask the students to kind of go through their assessment paper when they get it back and look at, you know, the areas where they got no marks, so they highlight that red, and so the amber is if they got some marks, and green is they've got full marks. Okay, and we're constantly reinforcing the information that they should be taking from that and helping them to kind of use that to move forward. And obviously, as you can see, we use MathsWatch, so we reference them the videos on MathsWatch to kind of support them with this process going forward. Okay. So every scheme of work also has this revision sheet, okay, which they can access from our website, which obviously we'll show to you a little bit later on. So they can see, you know, they know what scheme of work they are covering throughout that year. They can see the elements that are going to be included within that unit, and then they've got those list of must-watch videos that will help them be able to kind of identify the areas that they need to work on, and where they can access some revision that they might want to be able to look further into that. Okay, so this overview is important not only for the students but also for the teachers, so they can see how the skills being taught link throughout the year. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, this overview is so it's clear how the skills develop year on year. Okay, so this is one whereby this one here is, this is a scheme of work, and those are all the units and the elements of that unit within that scheme of work. And then obviously we've also got this overview, which is obviously for the teachers, that you can see that progression through the unit, okay, through each year, what the students will kind of be covering. Over to you, Abby.
Okay, so we're going to kind of hone in on one of the units, Unit D. It's the fourth unit we do in our scheme of work. It's Unit A, calculations, Unit B, number system, Unit C, indices, and eventually we move on to Unit D, which is the start of getting into algebra in a bit more depth, really. So it's quite a meaty unit. Now, what you see here is the learning points for Schema Work 3, which is typically what our Year 7s would start on. So I made a few connections between learning points and how they build on each other, but you'll also see on the left-hand side how there'll be elements from previous units which will feed into the current learning point. So it's those prerequisites and prior knowledge that they'll need to tackle the elements in this learning point. So it will build up. Sorry, Lou, can you do the next slide, please? Lou? Oh, thank you. Right. Sorry. So yeah, you'll see links both horizontally across the year and as the schemes of work progress vertically from year to year. So these are just a few examples. I mean, this will get sent out to you so you can have a look in more depth in your own time. But this would typically be what our Year 8s would cover, and then the next slide would be what our Year 9s would cover. So again, I've made some connections as to how what we do in these units is going to help what will come from later units. So we've really thought about what goes where and when we want to teach elements of the curriculum. So by the end of Schema Work 5, as Lou's already mentioned, students should typically be able to sit a foundation paper at this point if they are securing the knowledge in all of Schema Work 5. And then Schema Work 6 and 7, which will follow, are when the Year 10s would need to, the Year 10s who can tackle the higher would take on these units. And you can see does increase in difficulty, but it does build on a lot of elements from before. I'll say that'll get sent out to you so you can have a look in more depth when you get the chance.
Thanks, Abby. Right, so we also utilise some of our Year 11 time to develop faculty starters. So we asked each member of staff to kind of create a bank of starters based on the skills from the previous scheme of work. So they were randomly selected questions that the students will have covered in that previous year, and obviously for Year 7 it would have been what they'd have kind of covered in Key Stage 2. Okay, and it was something that teachers were happy to contribute to. Obviously we use the Year 11 time at the end of the year to kind of focus our attention on this. And they were happy to create these starters because obviously ultimately when we got to the next year there was a huge chunk of work that kind of was already done and that we've kind of collaborated on together, so it was that shared workload. We also, as I mentioned earlier, we had our maths scheme of our Rushey Mead maths.weebly.com, our website. Okay, and you'll be able to have a look at that later. It's a completely open website, and it's where we kind of signpost all the students to for their homework needs, but also any other kind of revision stuff that is going on. Okay, so we created a system that supported students with their independent practice, because we felt this was a huge part of their journey. We wanted them to kind of appreciate the importance of the work that they did. Okay, we utilise from this the skills checks from MathsBox. And these were a foundation for the weekly element of the homework, which was obviously the written element of their homework. We created examples to support the students, so they had some sort of guidance on how to complete the questions, but equally they were aware fully of the expectations that we had in terms of their presentation. So we were making it clear that we didn't just want a list of answers, we wanted them to be showing us how they were working out those questions. And obviously we also have the target sheets, which again have also come from maths, the information for those has come from MathsBox, but we've kind of supplemented them with links to core book maths videos, again to support the students in their process, that if they are stuck on a particular question, that they've got a video that might guide them through how to complete those questions. And also if they're getting a question wrong, because we'll mark them in class, that they've got something again to refer back to on top of anything that we go through in class. Okay, so our homework is obviously split differently for Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. So our homework expectation for Key Stage 3 was that it was 2 parts. They would do their weekly 10 questions, and then they would either do a task on MathsWatch or Dr. Frost. And the Key Stage 4 would be 3 parts that they would do: Weebly, MathsWatch and Dr. Frost. So on MathsWatch, we've kind of we set up a system of questions that everybody across the faculty could access, limited, sort of noted them in terms of what unit and what scheme of work they were relating to, the first one being an easier, and then obviously the difficulty throughout the weeks increased. For groups that had kind of maybe an LA group, we had these numeracy ones, which they would start with, and then they would move to the homework one, because they would be kind of those prerequisites before that first homework. And the students obviously on there have access to obviously all the questions, but equally they've got clips on there which they can watch, so they can support their homeworks that they complete on MathsWatch. And equally on Dr. Frost, I don't know if any of you have used it, but obviously we utilise more for Key Stage 3, but some for Key Stage 4, the key skills element. So we choose particular key skills that we may have been working on that they can get some further practice on. Or for Key Stage 4, we might look at the exam questions by topic. And we've uploaded or we're in the process of re-uploading our scheme of work onto Dr. Frost, which means the teachers can go into particular unit that they're covering and the particular scheme of work, and the individual skills are there, and they can choose those particular skills that they want the students to be assessed on that week. So we also provided as something to kind of guide them through. We realised we had a lot of students that most definitely wanted to do revision, but historically they were kind of always come to the point where they would kind of stop and go, well, I don't know how to revise, and where do I go? Okay, so we kind of put together some sort of guide to help them with how they identify their area of needs, and then how they kind of decide on where they go for that information, because we appreciated that they're in an age where there is obviously a wealth of information out there, and we wanted to kind of help narrow that down for them, to help kind of guide them towards where would be a good place for them to start. So we kind of guided them to the revision sheets, which we've mentioned earlier. And we also obviously guided them to how to use MathsWatch. So rather than just the work that we set them, how do they independently go on and find the necessary videos that are going to support their learning. We also obviously guided them how to use Corporate Maths, so they were aware of everything that was on there, and in particular for this element, how to use the video references that were given in their end of unit reviews, and how they can use those to support their learning further. And again, obviously, how they can use Dr. Frost, again, independently, aside from the work that would be set from the teacher. So we created a curriculum that provided a consistent diet for all the students, but we were still conscious at this point that there was still a large amount of planning that was still being completed individually by the teachers. Potentially, that in itself would have a lot of repetition of efforts across the department, and that potentially, although we had highlighted specific resources, obviously it wasn't a list that was, these are the only things that you will need, that planning time could still be more about resource selection rather than considering the pedagogy of the lesson that they were going to be teaching. So we wanted to make sure that everything that we were putting into the lessons was research informed, okay, and we wanted to make that sure that we were really deeply considering those pedagogical approaches. Okay, so the first thing we did as a faculty is we invested in the Craig Barton book, which I'm sure many of you have seen, and we used that as a really great source that we've seen. The teachers had it; they could refer to it at any point they wanted to, but at certain points throughout the year, when we had our kind of faculty time and our PL or collaborative planning, we would use that as a kind of a guide towards what we would do throughout the faculty time. So we were very obviously drawn initially to the fact that we worked examples were important. Okay, direct instruction is a strategy that was employed across our school. Okay, and obviously is fostered from those Rosenshine's principles of instruction. And in maths, obviously we'd started on this journey, but we'd obviously realised that although modelling was a natural part of that mathematics journey, that it wasn't always explicit. So students generally had no record of the model that potentially that we were doing in the classroom prior to this. And the follow-up tasks that the students then weren't asked to do weren't a similar example. So they could be a variation of that, which obviously made it complicated for the students to transfer those skills. So we kind of looked at what makes a good worked example. Okay, so if we are teaching add-on fractions, is using unit fractions for examples a good idea, and exploring what misconceptions that might bring. Is the orientation of a triangle important? When solving the equation, should the variable always be on the left? And making sure that we were considering those potential misconceptions when we were thinking about our worked examples. And we've also looked at quite a lot as the scripting of teacher exposition when we're looking at modelling worked examples. So we can think about what do we specifically want to emphasise. And Avi will go into a little bit more detail about that a little bit later. Okay, we're very much aware that mathematical exploration can create a huge cognitive load, okay, especially if the steps are not gradual and may interfere with efficient learning. Okay, so we wanted to scaffold the learning to develop those fundamental skills before they were progressing onto those AO2 and AO3 problem solving and reasoning questions. So we initially created a model learning journey for our first couple of units. And we kind of discussed as a faculty as to kind of the rationale as to what went into these. And obviously we used our faculty time to discuss this and used it to go through, and it was backed up with professional articles to kind of reinforce the thinking that had gone into the production of these units. So we always had the my turn, your turn. Okay, we now call them worked examples, but obviously the name has changed, but the principle behind them has been the same, that we were trying to keep them simple. So this model learning journey had examples that were closely linked teacher examples to the student terms, and we would again continually revisit these within the faculty PL sessions, so teachers could engage with the rationale. So it became an integral part of their own pedagogical approaches, because obviously at this point we'd only have one model learning journey that we were trying to kind of guide the students, the teachers into kind of this was our rationale behind it, and that they were then kind of thinking that this would be something that they would be able to replicate in future units with their groups. It was an important part of that where we wanted to reinforce that the answers were always there. So we have a policy now whereby the only thing that teachers mark is their termly assessments. Everything else is marked by the students in the classroom, whether it's self-mark or they are peer marking, which meant the feedback was instant. They're not waiting a week for the teacher to be able to get around to mark it. And let's face it, the marking we appreciated was, not a good use of the teacher time. Okay? And it was better for the student to get it in the moment. And it meant that they immediately could see if they've made a mistake, and we as teachers, we could be thinking about the questions where we might potentially expect them to be making mistakes, and we can go into more explicit detail on those particular ones. So again, we had lots of variation in terms of the examples and close related, and considering, okay, do we only want in terms of finding percentages, do we only want the ones where the value ranges in 0? Do we want to, how we transfer that through? And we also obviously had to ensure that within that learning journey that we kind of created opportunities for there to be spacing and interleaving of the prior learning that they would have covered. Okay, so they were able to kind of revisit that within those units. So we weren't just kind of isolating that unit of work and not making those connections. Excuse me. Something else that we did as a faculty is we were, as I said earlier, we're keen to develop further the diagnostic questions. And again, like I said before, we regularly utilise the insights function to explore the possible misconceptions. So as recommended by Craig Barton, we open the discussion about what is the most popular misconception and why do we think that. We then delve a little bit deeper and consider how and what we need to emphasise to try to eliminate the error. And if this was assessment for learning after the initial teaching, what questioning would be used to probe the students' thinking further? But as us as teachers in the faculty, we use this time to kind of go, okay, so if we are aware of these potential misconceptions, what specifically do we want to be emphasising when we are doing our initial exposition of a skill to try and, limit these possible misconceptions? So we went through, and I don't know if any of you use them, so obviously we know what the right answer is, but we can see within each question what the largest misconception was within each one. And we had those discussions, and we've always found those to be quite rich discussions across the faculty. Obviously, with the exploration of the diagnostic questions, we're backing it up with our articles and making sure that we have got those answers ready. But it helped us to unpick, like I said before, our students' understanding, and also helped create a collective understanding as teachers. So, as well as using those diagnostic questions that we got from the website, we also spent time within a faculty kind of developing our own diagnostic questions about, the minutiae of a particular skill that we wanted to, check the students' understanding on. We also looked at the misconceptions and made sure that they were a constant feature throughout our kind of learning journey, and make sure that we're making us aware and the students aware of those. And again, we're backing that up with referring to the articles within a particular journal, or obviously this has come from the Craig Barton's book. And we wanted to make it clear that the misconception was not something we wanted to shy away from during the teacher exposition, but something to celebrate. We don't want to be ashamed of making mistakes, but the more we explore them, the better they become at drawing on their knowledge and identifying the mistakes. And these explanations, when they are being asked to identify a mistake, help deepen their understanding. We obviously also, as a faculty, so this was obviously a set of questions that was part of this model learning journey. But again, during our faculty time, we kind of explored, the benefit of this type of set of questions over a random mixture of questions that we may have used previously. Okay, and obviously we can be posing to the students to help deepen their understanding about what they notice. And again, we refer back to obviously the variation theory website, which has got obviously lots of examples of these for us to kind of make use of. So within this model learning journey, there are lots of examples of kind of mixed difficulty questions and application questions, again, always with answers for them to self-mark. We had the mathematical etudes, and we also had this whole class think, pair, share, which is making them kind of, again, getting them to delve a little bit deeper. We also incorporated into it goal-free problems. And obviously we had those problem-solving elements and the SSDD, okay, and obviously extension problems. Now, obviously there was a huge amount in that first model learning journey that we put together, and we weren't saying to the teachers that this is what needs to be in every single unit, because not everything was suitable to every group and to every element of the curriculum. But it's kind of opening the understanding that all of these things and how they can form a really rich part of that development of the knowledge for the students. So there are obviously hurdles that we needed to overcome. Obviously, as I've mentioned before, there was resistance to change. Okay, and because we embedded that process within obviously using that professional learning time to share with the teachers the rationale for that change. They were soon to get on board, and it was great that we could go through this kind of journey together. We had to reorder of the units. Excuse me. So over the time we have reordered those units quite a few times. As we've gone through each year, it's ever evolving for us, so it's not a fixed finished document, but every year we reflect after each unit, we kind of get together as a faculty and discuss what has worked well and what necessarily maybe needs to kind of change for the future. I'm really sorry, excuse me. Also within that, we've moved elements between scheme of works as time's gone on. And we've potentially, we've within certain units, we've reordered the learning points within those units, because we felt on reflection that obviously wasn't optimum within that. And since then, we've also most recently we've created kind of A and B versions of our curriculum to kind of account for our LA and our MAHA learners. And also, as you might have seen earlier, we had all these borders that were appearing. We've decided that, in terms of cognitive overload, that they maybe weren't the optimum thing to have, so we removed those borders. So this is what I was talking about in terms of the in terms of the splitting of the units. So we created these A and B versions, and this would typically be kind of the path that we might expect an LA student to take. So in year 7, they'd look at the B version, which obviously would be focusing on that declarative and that procedural knowledge, and maybe only just touching into the conditional. Year 8, they would revisit it again, but obviously with the mind to kind of be pushing them more towards that conditional and being able to use that knowledge once they've revisited it to be able to go on to those conditional knowledge. And as you can see, we have an element whereby certain elements of the curriculum have been paused. For us, it was important that we made the appreciation that for some learners, they needed that extra time to be able to focus on those fundamental skills. So it's not that they would never cover it, because obviously, as you can see, some elements that they wouldn't necessarily have looked at in year 7 and year 8, but the prerequisite when they got to that in year 9 would be something that they would get to still explore. So that would be in their bronze element. So when they got to that, there would be more of a focus on that rather than the appreciation that would be their prior knowledge. But hopefully by doing this, we've managed to give them that extra time that they needed to kind of go through what we class as the important elements of the curriculum in those early 8 years. So again, we've got our MA students, so maybe a typical journey. Obviously, this is a gross generalisation. There is obviously slight nuances for all students in the curriculum, but they might start by doing the scheme of work 3, doing the A version, and then again doing the same for scheme of work 4 when they get to year 8. When we get to year 9, then we probably split that scheme of work 5. So we kind of give them that initial exposure in year 9, and then we go through deepening their understanding in year 10. And then in year 11, they would then be able to kind of tackle the scheme of work 6, which really is what we've kind of found is really the gateway to opening up a lot of that higher knowledge. Although obviously they're still not being taught every single thing, it has proven to be a gateway to opening up a lot of that knowledge. And we've had quite a few students that, although they, in the classroom, they've only studied up to scheme work 6, when they've got through their final GCSEs, they've still managed to achieve those grade 9s and those grade 8s. So, by that careful consideration about what we're teaching, it's definitely supported those students. And again, obviously, looking at a HA student, they would be obviously studying the A versions of all of those and being pushed each year. And we've got in year 11, they would be covering these 2 scheme of works, although it looks like I've mistyped that. So they would have scheme work 7 and scheme work 8. But we would group those together, and because we are dealing with our HA learners, they're more than capable of coping with the kind of the double learning that they would be doing within that year. So this is what our kind of model would look like across the year. So this is the obviously the year when we came back, when we had all the bubbles across different year groups. So we all start, all of year 7 is doing scheme work 3. Okay, and as you can see, the numbers after the teacher code identify how many units those students might be completing. Year 8 is a majority of this scheme of work 4. When we got to year 9, Most of them should have been doing year scheme work 5, but we appreciated that some of those other students in those lower groups would be still need to kind of, you know, gain that go over scheme work 4 so they could be more secure in that knowledge. But the reason why we kind of got that faded in, that it was allowed the teacher the opportunity where appropriate to kind of phase in some of that scheme work 5 knowledge. And obviously you can see in later year groups that was kind of a feature of the some of the scheme work. So the individual teachers would make a decision about what was appropriate for those particular groups in terms of picking up some of those elements from a higher scheme of work that they could move towards. And then obviously this is our current year. So we've now gone from what we had here, which was quarter bands in year 9, into half bands, which has mean we haven't got any of that phasing in. We've got a distinct scheme of learning for each group. We're still sticking with year 7 with scheme work 3, year 8 with scheme work 4, and again most of year 9 on scheme work 5 and so on. But it means that by the time we've got to year 11, we've got our sets 1 to 4, all of them accessing that high content. And you know, we would generally find that majority of the students in sets 1 to 4, I mean certainly sets 1 to 3, but the majority of students in set 4 would also be entered ultimately for that higher tier. And that has happened previously, but we're kind of seeing the fact that because we're able to kind of focus that curriculum time with that scheme work 6, and it's really supporting those learners being able to obviously access that, rather than the expectation that for some of them they might need to do some of that learning independently at home. So other things that has been a hurdle and potentially has changed over time. As I mentioned before, we had our starters, and you know, we had these starters whereby we'd all collectively created these, and they were a useful source, but we found as teachers that we would want to be modifying them, because we were keen that, you know, within the element of the starter, it was bridging that gap into the lesson that we were about to teach. So what we're now doing as a whole faculty is we're looking specifically at the prerequisite skills that the students need to be able to move on specifically within that lesson. So both of these are scheme work 5 starters. So initially we had here the prerequisite skills that were covered previously in scheme work 4. But when we look at this one here, we are specifically looking at those skills that were connected to what the students were going to learn in that lesson, where we were building up their confidence in able to tackle simultaneous equations. We've now got to a point where we are centrally creating model learning journeys. So trying to make sure that you know, the faculty, when they are looking at planning their lessons, that they you know, that time can be used, you know, really wisely. So we spend faculty time reviewing them so that all teachers have a shared understanding and the thought process behind the planning in these learning journeys. They are not a one size fits all. So I'm not saying that, you know, or we are not saying that the teachers go through every single slide and every slide must be covered by every single group. Still, you know, the teachers need to engage with the rationale, as they need to obviously supplement the maybe additional worked examples or tasks, and make that decision as to, you know, what element with particular group may need accelerating through, and they may need more, you know, more examples later on within that learning journey. We're also impressed that they are not, they're not expected to follow every single thing that is on there, but there are certain elements of those model learning journeys that we as a faculty have decided that this is the method that we are going to use. So there will always be certain elements whereby this is what we want to make sure that for this element, this is how we're teaching it. And we obviously discussed the rationale behind that. And, you know, we discussed the rationale as to why, you know, the reason why we're teaching it like this is because going forward, this is going to support them when they go into this element of their learning. So we've got those, that thought process. So the teachers are aware of what is already there, but obviously that they can also actively engage with it and tweak it as need be for their individual groups. We also have student booklets now that go alongside these. So every unit, the students are given a booklet that mirrors not every slide, but the slides that are appropriate for them to use. So they have got that kind of guidance. And obviously, that is something that became important during COVID, that they had something to work from. Something else that has changed is the end of unit reviews that I mentioned earlier. Initially, the idea was that they'd finish a unit and they'd immediately complete the end of unit review. We decided that this obviously didn't give the students, and it didn't give them the chance to kind of revisit that knowledge. And we wanted to kind of stagger in the fact that there would be that natural forgetting, and if we did it immediately after that unit, we probably weren't getting a true reflection of what had been learned. And we wanted to kind of make sure that we then factored in some time to allow them to have moved away from it, but also to encourage the students to do some independent revision. So what we now do is we'll teach Unit A, and then we'll immediately go on to teaching Unit B. And then towards the end of Unit B, we will then tell the students we're about to do an end of unit review for Unit A, and they've got a reasonable amount of time to prepare for that. And obviously we then move on to Unit C and so on. One other thing that we've kind of realised is that when we initially created these end of unit reviews, there were some questions within there that were obviously more towards that conditional knowledge. And we wanted, what we want now is those end of unit reviews to be kind of an indicator of that declarative and that procedural knowledge. So although I haven't had a chance to do it yet, but one thing we're looking to do is to kind of reform our end of unit reviews to kind of potentially have more questions, but whereby there is a focus more on that declarative and procedural knowledge, okay, and then less of the emphasis at this point on that conditional knowledge. Over to you, Abby.
Okay, so as Lou's already mentioned, the bulk of the work has been centrally planned. Now, obviously, as teachers, we'll use our professional judgment and add to it with scaffolds or extensions if required. But there are certain topics where we've decided as a faculty we are going to use this approach. Now, just to add on top of that, luckily the school has dedicated a lot of time for us to have meetings for PL to really talk about subject specific stuff in depth. So one of the things that we've been looking at recently and doing more of is scripting. So this was something we first explored as part of a Key Stage 3 reasoning project a few years ago. And with many new members of the faculty, we're looking at ways to kind of help develop their explanations and exposition. And we felt collaboration on a script could be a valuable use of PL time. So, well, this is we're going to be looking at factorizing quadratics, and I mean this is a typical topic where three of us could have maybe three different approaches of teaching it. So we've decided this is the approach we're going to use, and we're going to come up with the script together. So you'll see this kind of starts here, and it will gradually build up to the point where we are going to factorize quadratics using this grid method. And this was new for me as well. I've never done it like this before, so it was a valuable use of PL time. So we decided to employ this particular method for factorizing quadratics because it would help students transfer more confidently to factorizing where the x squared coefficient is greater than 1. However, we were aware that a lot of teachers were not confident in this approach, and there could be a temptation to go back to how we would typically do it. So to help with this, we got into small groups and kind of got one person up at the front. They'd explain how they would use this method to show to a student, and then we constructively critique the explanation, refine it, and then maybe another person would go, thinking about what we've just talked about, until we got to a point where we've done enough iterations that as a little team, we're kind of happy. This is the approach that we're going to go for. These are the key things I need to highlight. What are the important elements I need to emphasize and when I'm going to do that? Misconceptions, when am I going to address them? Is it going to be during the exposition? Is it going to be when it arises from a student question? All of these kinds of things we're thinking about in those little sessions of scripting. And then I found it personally really helpful when I eventually did use this method in the class, because I think if I was just thinking about it myself, there might have been a few things that I wouldn't have picked up myself, because I might have slipped back into maybe old ways of doing things. So having those group discussions and getting a bit of feedback has been really helpful. So yeah, we're going to continue trying more of that scripting elements and see how that goes. But so far, I think it's been quite useful. And yeah, at the end, we kind of all get back together in our big group and hear each other's explanations, and we can refine further. So that is the scripting side of things. And yeah, one of the things, well, as a trust now, the other schools in our trust are taking on the curriculum we are using, which will now be called the TMET curriculum. So they'll be getting used to the new curriculum as well. And one thing they wanted was kind of an overview of the different learning points, prior knowledge required, and where it's going to go. So this is kind of a breakdown document of the learning points in Unit A Schema Work 3, for example, that I've started creating. So you'll see it contains any notes, maybe on how we suggest teaching those elements, any prior knowledge and possible enrichment and challenge opportunities. Again, for example, with the enrichment and challenge, those elements might not already be in the modelled learning journeys that were created centrally, so the teacher would have to use their professional judgment and plan that in if required. But that's just one example of a breakdown. And then I think on the next slide, that will be Schema Work 5. So this is what the Year 9s would tackle, for example. But again, you can have a look in more depth when it gets sent out. And that would kind of bring us on to COVID. Now, Lou's already mentioned about student booklets. They were especially helpful over COVID because it gave the students a point of reference when we were doing online lessons. Now we're back in school, we need to, be mindful of elements that were covered in lockdown, but also elements that were missed both nationally and maybe on an individual year group. And we found diagnostic questions can be great to support in this process. It does make things a lot easier, of course, if you've carried a year group on from the previous year, because you'll know exactly what they covered, but it can be quite difficult if you're picking up a new group this year. So we found diagnostic questions can be really helpful to gauge where students are at. Also, I don't know if anyone uses graphic tablets. We use them over lockdown with online lessons, which has its obvious benefits, but also tried using them in class, and I found them really helpful. So that's something that I've taken from lockdown and transferred into the classroom. So I know visualizers are quite popular, but if you haven't had to go with the graphic tablet in lesson, it can be quite useful. Right, I think we're nearly there. So Lou's already mentioned what the picture looked like before the new curriculum was put in place, and the results were good. I know there wasn't a progress rate score, but students were probably making just a bit above progress rate. But when we've implemented the new curriculum, you'll see that the results have gradually got better year on year. And I think that's due to us, reflecting on what we've done and thinking about how we can make things even better, because this will never be a finished product, if you like. It's always going to be developed. There's always something to add, always something to change. So being able to dedicate those times in faculty meetings to those discussions, which will help develop the curriculum, will ultimately help the students. And I think that's seen year on year here. So yeah, there's definitely been a positive impact since the new curriculum has been introduced. But yeah, again, these are some of the things that we found helpful to our success so far. Obviously, that will be ongoing, but on the next slide as well, there's a lot of websites that we use to support our planning and developing the units. This will all get sent out to you, and I think, Lou, if you do the next slide, that will be, this will all get sent to you, I believe. And I think finally we are on other features. So enrichment and additional support. We found the year 10, we did year 10 revision sessions last academic year, and I've noticed the benefit from that with the students that I've taken through to this year. So that was quite helpful. We like to run the UKMT Maths team challenges. Now I know that's not on anymore, but we're still trying to do something similar just to keep that enrichment going, and various other monthly challenges on our website, and we run a weekly study club. So there's a few enrichment opportunities, and luckily the faculty is quite helpful in supporting with these and creating these opportunities for the students. So that's been a real benefit. I think that kind of takes us to the end, Lou, and I think we can probably take any questions if anyone has any.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put the chat up on the screen. Are you able to check the chat, Abby? Is there anything that we can kind of answer from there at all?
Yep. Yeah. Would you say you follow mastery?
Yeah, we are. It's that element, but we're obviously not specifically following that as such. But yeah, we are wanting the students to kind of have that mastery approach of those skills and have that kind of depth of understanding within everything that they are being faced with.
Yeah. How long did this all take? So since 2014 developing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the initial, as we said, those initial conversations happened back in 2014, and the initial things with the kind of the quick checks and the big questions and the end of unit reviews, they all kind of happened within that first year, so they were ready for the next year. But the overall development of everything is has been since that point, so it's been quite a few years in the making. But we feel like we're now benefiting from that, but we're utilizing the fact that we've had new members of staff in the faculty, and it's great to see that the systems that we've put in place has been something that they've been able to kind of easily make sense of and kind of develop with us going forward. So yeah, it's been a long time in the making, but it's not complete. We're not saying that everything that we do is is a perfect model. Like I say, we get together as a faculty on a regular basis and critique what we've put into those learning journeys, and have those discussions about whether we felt the quality was what we wanted it to be, or whether we've had to tweak it too much. And if quite a few of us have had to tweak it, then we go back to the drawing board. So it's certainly not finished, but yeah, the initial journey kind of, it started in the year that I first joined Rushey Mead, so a few years ago, from that 2014-15.
Yeah. Right, what sort of faculty time? Lou, is it worth stop sharing the screen actually? Then you'll be able to see the questions as well.
I just didn't want to. Yeah, can do.
Oh yeah. What sort of faculty time were you being given by SLT on a monthly basis?
So across the year, we have 10 PL Mondays, which on those days the lessons are shortened by 10 minutes, which then gives us as teachers from 2 until 4 to focus on professional learning. There's potentially an element where it's whole school, but then it transfers back to how we then specifically take that into the faculty. So there isn't the expectation that every faculty does everything exactly the same. So we have those sessions. I think we have about 10 or so like middle leaders / co-planning sessions across the year. And we also, I can't remember exactly how many faculty meetings we have across a year, but it's a similar amount. So we do have a fair bit of time given to us, and we're hugely grateful of that. And it means that we can spend that time, and we tend to try and, especially when we've got faculty meetings, try and limit what we are, any information that we need to just pass over to the faculty. We do it through, we have a weekly maths headlines that we send out, so that when we're in those faculty meetings, we can spend that time as well looking at the curriculum and kind of having those conversations. So it isn't, it's something that we feel that would have been better placed in an email.
How often does the teacher assess work? Do they mark? So the end of unit assessments will be taken after the following unit. So it could be every, say, 3 to 4 weeks. The end of unit assessments, end of unit review, sorry, can be marked by students in class just by swapping papers, or we take them in if it might be easier to just mark ourselves. But again, that can be done in a lesson. The termly assessments, though, we mark those ourselves. Now, with the scripting the model, are you role playing a class in front of you? We do it kind of in a role play style and do it in a similar time frame, and that really helps us get to the point, the key things we want to emphasize, exactly what we want to say. So we imagine there's a class in front of us, do it as a role play, and our teachers, sometimes if there's something in the explanation that we're not quite sure of, or we might be thinking how a student is, we kind of ask that question to the teacher and see what kind of response we get. And that's all good. That's all useful for planning, I think. And I think there's another question similar about what resistance did you find with script? I wouldn't say there's been much resistance in our faculty, to be honest with you. There's maybe a few members of the team who are not so keen to stand up in front of their small group and model the example, but they still contribute with points to consider, and it's good for them to be in that team to see maybe what would be the best agreed approach when they come to do it anyway. So we don't tend to force them to get up and script, but if you're breaking out into small groups, trying to think about maybe a few people who are quite keen to do that, and everyone from the group will benefit from it, I think. Homework, we use we have 10 Weebly questions which we use from Maths Box, both in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. All Key Stage 3 students and Key Stage 4 students will do a weekly Maths Watch. Dr. Frost, we use that. Now that will be kind of optional for Key Stage 3. The teacher will use their judgment if the class can kind of handle it, or it can be used as a bit of stretch and challenge, but it's compulsory for all our Key Stage 4. So Key Stage 3 get 2 pieces a week. Key Stage 4 get 3 pieces of homework a week.
The whole school, somebody's mentioned about the whole school in terms of marking. We have got a whole school kind of approach whereby, any marking that teachers are doing, it needs to be something that is, going to hugely benefit those students. And obviously that's down to each faculty to kind of work out what is appropriate within their subject. And obviously, in maths, we've kind of said that, the most valuable feedback to a student is in the moment, and it means that, we're limiting the time that teachers are spent marking things. They're obviously circling around the classroom and they're seeing what students are getting wrong. They might live feedback in the lesson that quite a few students have got a particular question wrong, so they'll model that. But the benefit for us is obviously, the teachers aren't spending a lot of time at the weekends marking. I know when I first started, I would probably spend my whole weekend, taking all my books home and marking them. And the reality of that is that actually the benefits to students wasn't great, and I didn't enjoy that process. And it was quite difficult for some of us to break those habits, but the reality is that it's been far more beneficial to have that in-class marking, and for us to circulate and to kind of get a picture of, you know, where those errors are being made for the group. So, you know, whether we stop the whole class or we speak to an individual. But it's certainly been, you know, beneficial for us that your teacher time is spent on kind of considering the pedagogical approaches that you're going to take within a particular lesson, and what your exposition is going to be, you know, for that particular group.
I think there was a question: how do you revisit topics or questions that students have got incorrect or misunderstood from unit assessments? How do you build into curriculum time? Yeah, so Lou mentioned how we use starters to tackle elements that will come up in the lesson, but if we've done a recent unit assessment and it's been highlighted that there are some areas that we need to go back on, we try to hone in on those questions, put them in the starters. So that's one way we could use the curriculum time to kind of highlight those areas of weakness, if you like.
Yeah, we want the starters to be a definite kind of a feed into that lesson, but we're also aware that it's really useful for that time to be revisiting stuff that we know that, you know, we've got an idea that, you know, the individuals or, you know, the majority of the group weren't secure on, so we get an opportunity to revisit those during the starters. So as we progress through the year, there will always be an element of the starters that will be directly linked to the lesson, but there may be an element of those starters that are specifically focused on that prior learning that we know that we need to kind of readdress.
So I'm just trying to catch up on questions. How long do you allow in the lesson for starters? Personally, about 10 minutes, no more than 15, I think. If we've got our lessons, so yeah, I'd go about 10 minutes. I try to stick to that.
Yeah, I think generally we try to stick to 10. It's only particularly maybe in year 11 groups when you're specifically going over something, because you might want to spend more time going over more of those questions, because, you know, we put those starter questions up, we won't necessarily go through how we go through all, you know, every single, we might just display the answers for some of them and have a deeper discussion about others. You know, because obviously if you have all those questions on the board, if you go through every single question, you are going to eat into a lot of lesson time. So again, that is kind of down to the teacher to decide, but we kind of ask teachers for an absolute maximum of 15, and as a general rule, you know, try and make it, you know, a maximum of 10 wherever possible.
Yeah. There's a question about sharing the schemes and resources. I don't know if we can do that at the moment. I think there's going to be a link to the kind of general overview in what gets sent out in the Rushey Mead Weebly page. Lou, I don't know if you have any more on that.
Yeah, I think obviously you're going to get an overview, and you can look at the Rushey Mead Weebly to see how it's all broken down. But the individual, I mean, obviously we're happy to kind of have those individual conversations, but it's not something that as a whole package we're kind of sharing, kind of just the principles behind the process that we've kind of gone through as such.
Yeah, that's a good question. How do you adapt for your least able students? You mentioned all these things. Yeah. So all students will start Schema Work 3. There's not an intervention group for Schema Work 1 and 2, but as kind of mentioned, if the group is quite low ability, as teachers we need to look at ways we can put elements into scaffold to eventually build up to maybe at least a bronze section with low ability groups. So I've got a bottom set year 7 group this year, and there's certain elements that are in the silver parts of the learning journey, which I don't think they'll be able to access fully. I mean, the goal is to still try and get there, but I've got to put elements in that are not already in the journey for me, well, to help them get to where they need to be. So we do add to the PowerPoints and try to support them that way in class. And we do have a dedicated teacher on an intervention year group, but obviously we can only tackle a certain number of students. So we try to get as much done in class as we can with that.
And obviously, as we mentioned before, we kind of pause certain elements of the curriculum for those groups to allow them a greater amount of time on those kind of fundamental units. I just noticed somebody else's comment about the for mixed attainment groups. I think it would work because we've got the the elements within there, obviously as is a setted across all year groups. But we have, especially in year 7 and year 8, we have what we call quarter bands. So within those, we have within those bands, within those groups, there is quite a wide spread of attainment within those groups. And we have found it, working for those groups. So I think it would be applicable. I mean, obviously there would have to be slight changes, but I think it is something that could be applied to a mixed attainment group. Okay, I think that's it. I think we've answered
I think we have
everybody's questions. Obviously, if there are further questions, as you obviously have time to explore things and you want to ask us stuff, then you are more than welcome to kind of send an email across to Challenge Partners and they will forward it to us, and we'll answer those as much as possible.